Thank you for joining me on my soapbox today. My name is Mindy Prefling, and I am the Client Services Senior Manager for Spencer Ogden, a global energy and infrastructure recruitment agency. As global recruitment experts in energy and infrastructure, we're building an industry that impacts millions. We provide leading recruitment services to our clients and candidates, creating careers to power a sustainable future. The Soapbox series is a podcast we've launched to have open discussions with thought leaders in the renewable energy industry, to discuss the human element behind our industry and the challenges we face in recruiting, retaining, and promoting top talent, especially as it pertains to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Today's guest is the Executive Director of WRISE, Women of Renewable Industries and Sustainable Energy, a nonprofit organization whose mission is to accelerate the transition to a sustainable and equitable energy future by igniting the collective power of community. My relationship with WRISE dates back to 2017 when I joined the Denver Boulder chapter. I was both new to the renewable energy industry and new to Denver. I saw WRISE as an opportunity to network professionally and meet local prospective clients and candidates. What I didn't realize was that it would be an opportunity to meet new, like-minded, career-focused women who would become my close friends. WRISE hosts national networking events, luncheons, webinars, and my personal favorite, an annual leadership forum for members and non-members alike to network with other professionals, and offers workshops for career enrichment. Local WRISE chapter events vary, but include peer mentorship groups, roundtables, book clubs, happy hours, and the like. On today's episode, Kristen and I talk about the elephant in the room, the lack of gender and racial equity in renewables, and how, as an industry, we're not doing enough to close the gap. So who is responsible and what can we do to address these issues? While these questions are complex, we overcomplicate the solution. Kristen is here to offer her own support, share resources, and on a high level, explains how companies can overcome the disparity in representation across gender and race. All right, Kristen, thank you for joining me on my soapbox today. I'd love to have you kick us off with a brief introduction to yourself and to WRISE.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me and having these an important space for these conversations. So I'm Kristen Graf. I'm the Executive Director of WRISE, which is Women of Renewable Industries and Sustainable Energy. We're a national nonprofit focused on accelerating the transition to a sustainable and equitable energy future. And we really do that through igniting the power of community. It's one of the things I think is amazing about our space and the people that come in to work with us and connect with us across the network, is not only a passionate commitment to their own career development and their own work, but also to sort of what is the bigger vision for what we can be as an industry, what we can be as a sector, and how engaged the whole world can be in all of that we're doing. So that's sort of the big picture. WRISE has 35 chapters across the US and a few in Canada, and those folks are doing that work at the local level. We like to think about it across the whole picture of our work, from recruiting more amazing folks into the sector to the retention and advancement, which is both working with individuals on their own career path, but also working with companies, the other side of that in terms of policy and corporate culture, and how do we make sure that the workforce and the companies, the organizations that are building that workforce are creating a space that's really open and welcoming and inclusive and challenging in the really great ways so that people want to stay and grow their careers here. And then how do we work on visibility and recognition for all of those amazing folks? And I just want to say, we do use the word women in our name. We are Women of Renewable Industries and Sustainable Energy, but we want to be really clear that we aren't specifically about women. We are about women, but we recognize sort of the whole spectrum of gender and the importance of recognizing that it's not just about women and men or something like that, but there is an incredible amount of work to be done across everybody, regardless of gender, and a recognition of gender minorities that have not been engaged historically, and sort of what all of that looks like. So just want to make that part clear too. Yeah.
Actually, that is a really important designation and something I was curious about myself. So thank you for clarifying that. I think our audience will appreciate that. So I'm really excited to go through this episode together and unpack a lot of what you've talked about. And I know a lot of our listeners and just my clients would be really interested in some of the advice you have. So we'll get into the policy, corporate culture recommendations, and so on that you have, along with what WRISE can do to support that. But I'd really love to take some time to learn a little bit more about you. So I'd love for you to take it back to the beginning of your career. I mean, even if you want to go to undergrad, how you got started, where you got started, and then bring us up to present day.
Sure. Yeah. Yep. I mean, I think it maybe even goes back before undergrad, but it's one of those crazy things of a long time personal passion for environment, broadly the outdoors, and a personal passion for that, but also being just like a massive math and science nerd from a very young age, and some incredible teachers along the way that explained to me what engineers were and what they did, and my excitement for technology, and talked to me about renewable energy before I ever saw anything. So literally the back of my high school yearbook has notes about seeing my wind turbines someday from friends. And I had still never actually seen one in person at that point, but I was just like hooked on the idea of technological solutions to, big problems, air quality, climate, things like that. It was still, I'm old enough, it was still early in climate conversations back then. But renewable energy was solidly in the queue. So I went out into the undergrad world looking for engineering programs to address environmental work, but I wasn't connecting with the concept of like traditional civil and environmental engineering. There's important work there, but I was really, really committed to the idea of renewable energy as I was looking. And there were really not that many programs at that point in time. Thankfully, there are a lot more now that are really focused on those connections between engineering and renewable energy. But I went to Cornell to do what at the time was called agricultural and biological engineering, because they had a bit of a focus on that and a really strong background in the agriculture and environmental interactions and those pieces. And it was just seemed really exciting and a good place to go. So I talk about in general sort of the two big things that happened in my mind that sort of cemented career path at that point. But one is that there were only a couple of women in my freshman calculus class, and that it just kind of blew my mind. I knew the history of not many women in science and technology, but I really thought we were past it. My high school classes, high school calculus, all of that stuff was full of really smart, amazing women. So it just hadn't occurred to me that they wouldn't go into engineering or, this path also. And so that was a real wake-up call. And I got really involved with the Society of Women Engineers at that point and started paying a lot of attention to the research going on around why women weren't going into technology as much and what was happening. So that's just was always a personal interest and passion. And then I think I also had this, idea that I was going to be some amazing engineer with some brilliant new technology that then everybody was going to build wind turbines everywhere. And, going into the weeds of it in a degree, you realize, wow, the technology is really far along. There's always stuff to do to improve it and make things better and make it work in different ways. I love all my friends that are in the engineering space in the sector, but my sort of puzzling brain mind went sort of higher and higher pieces of like, why isn't this happening? Like, this technology is amazing. Why isn't it being built? And just really got interested in what were the policy pieces, what were the market pieces, what was public perception going, like what was happening that people weren't deciding to build renewables. And so I went from that undergrad work to I did a few years of a grad program thinking like maybe I can make this work in grad school, and grad school wasn't for me. That's a story for another day. But I went into the Union of Concerned Scientists as a way to really merge these pieces around policy and technology, and just had an amazing opportunity to work with tons of incredible folks, really grounded in science and data and sort of that rigorous side of policy analysis and of environmental work and moving things from that angle. And so that was an incredible place to be. And I learned so much about policy and markets on that side of stuff. And, from there, just really had moments of, wow, like there's so much important work to be done on the policy side. And yet there were still some really glaring things to me from my um, commitments to women in technology and from working across sort of the diversity and equity conversations early on, feeling like, how is nobody noticing that it is a lot of white men sitting together in public utility commissions, in the halls of Congress, making all of these big decisions about where our energy future lies and what's going on. And it just became painfully obvious to me that there weren't enough different voices in the conversation to get us to the kinds of solutions we needed. And so when the opportunity came up to come to RISE, which was at the time WOWI, I would love to say I jumped on it right away. I totally didn't. I had one of those moments of like, is this something I should do? Can I do this? Is this the right thing? And I had to like talk it through a million people. But then once all of them were like, oh my God, this is the perfect thing for you, I was like, yeah, maybe it is the perfect thing for me. And then finally, put my application in, and now here I am, way later. But yeah.
I love that. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear a little bit more about the mission of the Union of Concerned Scientists, but then I'd love to segue into RISE and talk about the history of RISE.
Yeah.
But at the time, WOWI, and then kind of go through some of that with you. So if we could start with what's the mission of the Union of Concerned Scientists, and then go from there.
Yeah, and they have had their own evolution there as well. But basically, the concept is to bring rigorous data and science to big world problems. And they have the roots of that organization come from scientists, mostly scientists at MIT that were involved in the very early days of nuclear weapons, right? And had this moment of like, what am I allowing my passion for science to create in the world? And how do I, step back and say, we have this information that we were doing for science sake, and now we're really nervous about how it's being applied in the world. And we don't want to allow the work that we've done to be applied in the world in this way, in terms of, it dominantly started with nuclear weapons. It moved from there into like, what's going on with nuclear energy and how are we thinking about that? And from there into broader energy conversations, climate work, and now they're one of the major environmental organizations playing in the climate space specifically as well, and really committed to sort of the interaction of data and science with public policy. And how do we make sure we're bringing good science to bear? How do we understand how scientists are engaging in policy? And then how do we think about that in terms of these large, complex global problems? So amazing place in terms of just incredible down-to-earth people who have phenomenal minds and backgrounds and really care about connecting it to how that plays out in the world as a whole.
We probably need more organizations like that with where we're
I
at.
think so. I think they're doing great work. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like then, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but your move to RISE, though difficult, maybe was an opportunity for you to marry your passion for the environment and renewable energy and your passion for like social justice and just like what you had talked about earlier on in your, like when you were in undergrad, this realization that there was just no diversity in the industry. So this was an opportunity, I presume, for you to get involved and make an impact there?
Yeah, it was this kind of crazy intersection of things that I cared deeply about, and sort of a recognition that there were amazing people working on the policy side, and that while that's incredibly important and people need to continue that work and be a part of it, and I loved being a part of it while I was, that both I felt like I had something important to offer in terms of how we get more diverse voices into those conversations in the first place, but also just for my own personal, like, the policy trek is a slow, hard slog, right? It is, you have to be in it, in the weeds, looking for those small nuances and being committed to like long haul, long-term change. And for me, I was like just desperate to get back to people that were building projects, that were putting steel in the ground to generate electrons, and to feel more connected to industry again. And that sort of, at least the technology side of it. I'll say over time, I've noticed in myself a deep shift from that, you know, high schooler completely committed to technology as the fix, the solution for all of our woes, to a person who recognizes the power of technology, but who knows so much more and understands so much more the context, that that technology is never going to get us there unless the rest of the systems around it, including all of the voices in the conversations about it, about how it's built, about how it's financed, about who's involved and who gets the benefits. When those conversations have shifted to really include everybody, then we have a better opportunity to actually build the stuff we need to build. Yeah.
Great. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the history of RISE.
Sure.
When you joined in 2009, RISE was still WOWY. And then I think it was 2017, you all rebranded as RISE. Talk to me about the history of RISE, even back to its founding, and yeah, get us up to date.
Yeah, and in fact, it was founded before me. It was founded in 2005 as originally Women of the Wind, but adjusted to Women of Wind Energy, and by some incredible women across the sector who knew each other and were really committed to seeing a shift in the number of women across the industry as a whole. There was an amazing woman that they all knew named Red Meyer, who was an incredible advocate in the Colorado area. In fact, is kind of single-handedly understood to be the one who got Xcel Energy to move forward with their early voluntary green energy program by basically tons of signatures and door-to-door knocking and phenomenal community organizing and just a brilliant energy about her. And she passed away, unfortunately, and the folks that knew her said, we have to commit to her legacy and to what that looks like. And so it was with that extra push that they pulled together some funds from friends and companies to start a fellowship program, which continues as our Red Meyer Fellowship Program and has now expanded into other fellowship programs since. And you know, out of those early days, really recognizing the organic energy all across the sector to see more diversity. And, you know, at the time it was very focused on the gender diversity that was lacking, but a recognition of more beyond that. And, you know, it started with that fellowship program. It grew to have the luncheons associated with it, and out of those and bringing more people together, an interest in getting together more often sparked our chapters, and folks coming forward in those spaces and saying, we want to understand more from other senior leaders and executives. We want to start a mentoring program. Just a lot of organic growth around what folks needed and wanted to see across the sector. And so it was actually at the second luncheon they hosted, which was in Pittsburgh at the Wind Power Conference in 2006. I was still at the Union of Concerned Scientists, and a good friend of mine from college who knew about this like passionate interest of mine was like, you have to come with me to this lunch. It's Women of Wind Energy. I was like, that sounds amazing. So that was my like early introduction, was at one of the lunches, and just blown away by that community. And I was in Boston at the time, so a chapter got going there, and I just kind of stayed a little bit looped in and connected. So then when I was starting to ponder a little bit what might be my next move, is it the right time for me to move on from the Union of Concerned Scientists, was right around when they started to send out a note about looking for an executive director. So it was just kind of an amazing lineup, where it had been, as an organization, run by a steering committee of about 7 women who were, you know, taking on more and more work and bringing in more folks, and realizing there was so much enthusiasm and energy that maybe it was time to take it to the next level. It had been sort of a program within an organization called Windustry in the Twin Cities. And they decided to pull together enough resources to sort of become their own entity entirely. And that's when they also decided to hire an executive director. And I was lucky enough to get in the mix and push that across to be able to be that person. So I came in, and from there we spent a lot of time building infrastructure and getting folks connected and engaged at the national level. And then, as you said, 2017 sounds like a long time, but I would say by 2012, we were starting to do work across more than just wind. A lot of folks we were watching moving into the solar sector from the wind space, and then slowly sort of more connections there. And over time, programming and energy storage was starting to bubble up, and really a lot of interest from our chapters in doing more programming, as folks that had been involved were sort of watching their own careers move and shift. So we had been sort of navigating that space for a while, and it just had become really clear, I would say by late 2015, that in order for us to continue to do that work and have a stronger presence, we really needed to lean into it enough to change our name. And so we undertook a big stakeholder process and engaged a lot of folks in our transition working group, and came out with the rebrand in 2017. So it was just a really exciting, intense long-term process, but really good. And I think we made some incredible decisions at that point. And I'm so thankful for everyone that was involved in that process, because it's gotten us to where we are now, which is continuing to grow and see engagement across not only those spaces. These days, I would say we're still very heavily focused on wind, solar, and storage, but we're seeing engagement across smart grid, across clean vehicles, mobility, transmission overall, all these different pieces, even a bit of green building, folks that are doing corporate sustainability, social responsibility type pieces, a broader conversation about having everyone engaged in that work. So it's really exciting.
Yeah, I agree. I can relate to your first experience with WRISE. 10 years later, when I first it was a luncheon, somebody invited me to see what WRISE was all about. And this was, I guess actually, no, it was 2017, because it was just after the rebrand.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
Totally.
so it was 2017. And I had a similar experience, that it was just a really warm and welcoming community. And I met some women there, I'm in the Denver Boulder chapter. And I met some women there that I still to this day, 5 years later, are friends with, or I am friends with. So I can really relate to, I guess, just the warmth in the community that WRISE brings. And it's grown so much in the last 5 years.
It's incredible.
It is really incredible. So, okay, so understanding that WRISE has evolved over time, kind of from this, focus on diversity early on, but then has over time added in luncheons, mentoring, and other, seminars and forums for people to meet. I'm curious what your day-to-day is like as the executive director.
Yeah. It's an amazing evolution, because now we are a team of 5. So it's and that's just recently. We brought our 2 most recent folks on in October. So it's changed. Thank you. We're very excited about everybody. And it's been an amazing shift for me from the early days, and still, I do a lot of a little bit of everything. But, in the beginning, when it was really just me and a lot of volunteers, I was doing the website on the back end. I was doing the budgets and the board strategy and all of the different pieces. Whereas now we have an incredible team, still small, but mighty. And that allows me to, stay focused as much as possible on sort of the bigger picture pieces that are going on, whether it's our overarching strategy and strategic planning, it's some of our new programs and new program development. It's working with our board, it's working with our fundraising folks, and sort of how we're thinking about the overall business and what our revenue models and all those pieces look like. It allows me to play a little bit more of a purely executive role, although it will never be quite all all that. When you have a small team, everybody does a little bit of everything.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, so I'd love to hear a little bit more about how big RISE is now in the time. I mean, your team has grown, obviously, which I would assume means the organization has grown. So what's your member base now?
Yeah, we have about, I'd say a little over 16,000 people that are participating in the organization in one way or another.
Impressive.
2,000 of those approximately are paid members, sort of in the weeds of that programming. But our programming is sort of a broad mix of stuff that is focused on our members and stuff that is more broadly open to the public overall as much as possible. Yeah, but exciting.
Yeah, I think that's pretty impressive because I know I'm a member, but I know that you can attend a lot of the, I mean, you can come to the luncheon. Nobody's going to sit there and like, check your RISE pin or anything like that.
Right, you can get a discount as a member on your tickets for those events when they're it's like a luncheon. You have to pay a little bit to help us cover food costs or whatever. So yeah, member
So,
discounts are sort of how we function, but trying to keep as
okay.
much as possible broadly open. Yeah.
Okay, so the benefit to be a member would be a discount on the leadership forum or something
Yeah,
like
that's
that.
a piece of the benefits. I think there's also some incredible, sort of connections to the community that are taken to the next level when you are a member, whether it's, some of our chapters that offer, in addition to public programming, some members only programming. But we also have the online member center, which includes like the directory of all of our members, so access to them in that network, but it also includes our webinar archive with all of our webinars going back to 2011. So, any current webinar when it's hosted is open to the public, but then to get access to the recordings and things like that, and to go all the way back to the beginning, is sort of a member access piece.
Okay, that's helpful. Well, I'd love to talk about what we both are very interested in and why we're hosting this series, the diversity, equity, and inclusion issue in the industry. So we've talked a little bit about what the mission of RISE is. In 2020, Spencer Ogden ran a survey across people in the industry and the state of diversity in renewable energy, and almost 50% of the respondents said they felt like nothing had changed or that, in fact, the industry had become less diverse. So I'd love to hear what you think.
Yeah, I would love to continue to see, there are a few places that are giving us the like in the weeds data collection demographics on some of the data around the diversity of the sector. And I'd love to see, more of that continuing over time and to really showcase sort of the intersections of some of those pieces. We get a lot of gender data, well, I should say it's not really a lot. We get some gender data, we get some racial equity data. We don't have a lot of that intersection to understand within this sector specifically what's going on for women of color, and those experiences. But I would say, there has been a shift on the gender side, but it looks at sort of how you have to think about the timing of it, right? And how long you're looking at it. So as long as I've been in the sector, and before that, there's not a ton of hard data, but there's some, and then there's sort of anecdotal evidence of sort of tracking across events and things that we've seen. But, I would say 10, 15 years ago, it was maybe across the whole industry, low 20%. And I would say now we're tracking up closer to 30% from a gender specific lens only. The racial equity numbers are far lower. But that 30% piece, I would say in the last few years, we've actually seen it dip a bit again. And 2020 is a really intense year, right, itself. And so sort of in multiple levels, what we know as overarchingly the Great Resignation now, how many people left their jobs for all sorts of reasons. But what we also understand in terms of the number of women that left the working world overall. I saw a great quote that I've used a few times with folks lately, but in a blog not long ago that, many countries have social safety nets of all different kinds, but the United States has women. So when things come down to brass tacks in terms of caring for children, caring for 6 folks, caring for anybody, sort of the whole care economy in the United States is really distorted and problematic. And so we don't take care of caregivers as a whole, those that are paid or those that are doing that work unpaid. And because a lot of that falls on women in the end, there are a lot of women that felt they had to leave their jobs, whether they wanted to or not. And some of them chose to as part of that broader context of the Great Resignation. But we also saw a lot of folks taking a much deeper dive on racial equity, right? After the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, all of those conversations spiked to an entirely different level than I've seen in this sector in the past. There were a few great companies on the forward edge of that stuff early on, but the level that both, I think, overall employees in the sector were pushing their companies, as well as externally consumers pushing companies, investors pushing companies. There was a whole new level of sort of desire to look at what that looks like, what's going on, what those experiences are, and what's happening. And the reality that we've known for a long time is that the renewable sector is not doing nearly what it could or should be doing from a racial equity position. And that plays out in terms of the numbers overall, and in terms of then that subset of women of color specifically, that's just unfortunately abysmal in terms of what we're doing to support them in the sector.
Yeah, those are some pretty dire numbers that you shared. I'm curious with that, what you think or who you think is responsible for changing it, changing the narrative and fixing this problem, because it is a problem. And from the clients that I work with, I definitely see an effort coming from different levels. And depending, I work with hiring managers. I'm in the thick of hiring, and with this divide that we have, and in the market that we're in, where there are just more jobs than there are people, it's a really good opportunity to start hiring in more diverse, racially, gender, whatever the case may be. Anyway, I'm saying a lot of different things, but I'd love to get your take on who you think is responsible for fixing this problem, and then with this opportunity, what can we do to fix this?
Right. Yeah, I mean, to the first point of who's responsible, everybody. Every single person has something they can or should be doing. But within that context, right, where are your points of leverage? What is your power? How much responsibility do you carry in this? And I think it's quite proportional, right, to the amount of power and clout you have to change things, to the amount of responsibility you have to make that change, right? And so obviously it falls really heavy on the folks in the C-suite, where we tend to see a lot of rhetorical support, a lot of people putting out statements or commitments. But to your point about hiring managers, there's another quote I've heard a lot is, and I think I heard it from Sally Krawcheck most recently, but someone else, I'm sure, maybe along the way, but that middle management is where diversity goes to die. That sense that, and I think, this will get to, I think, my piece of like what I think is really important, especially from the C-suite level. If you are rhetorically on board and you think, and you get the importance of diversity, right? Like there are still people that need to have the business case made to them. To them, I say there is so much data. It is painful to have folks still wonder about the value of diversity. So to the extent you're there, there's like metadata to that point now, right? That diversity is better for business, period. We just need to lay that to rest. Diversity and diverse opinions, backgrounds, talents, all of that in the mix is what helps us make better decisions and builds better businesses in the long run. But the reality of that is that the folks, to get that diversity, to get that mix in the room, we have to create the environment, create the culture, create the space that allows it to thrive. And if we aren't, as CEOs and executives, creating structures, thinking about our values, creating programs, making sure that this is a high top level priority and that everybody understands it. And as a result, we're building structures to support everybody that wants to commit to it. and address sort of like how it plays out in behavior, right? Because when you think of something rhetorically or you think it's a great idea, that's awesome. But if you don't have all of the pieces of the environment in place so that when that hiring manager is stressed out about meeting a bottom line, is stressed out about meeting a deadline on a project development, that's a whole other piece of their work, when they're stressed out about all these other things, do they have the tools they need to interrupt the bias in the hiring process? Do they have the tools they need to know that this is a priority? Is it part of their performance review? Is it part of their budget process? Are they going to be rewarded in some way for taking this on? Because yes, we would love for everybody to just get how important it is and take it on out of their own goodwill. But the reality is behavior falls on that all the time. We fall on what's stressing us out, on what's convenient, on what lets us move forward. And as much as we might care about something, if we haven't built those behavioral structures, those things may fall to the side because we don't have a system in place to force us to prioritize it.
Yeah.
And so that system, that structural system, and making it happen, that does fall on the C-suite, right? So you can put out a statement and that's awesome, but how do you follow through and make sure that that is permeating through every level of your company? You know, I talk about it sometimes, like people have gotten the message around safety, right? We talk a lot about like a culture of safety, especially in construction or environmental or not in construction or engineering organizations. Everybody has their moment for safety. You have your safety team, you have your safety across it. It's woven through everything. And so how do we start thinking about diversity and equity on that level? You can't just hand it off to your top level woman at your company who happens to care about diversity, or your top woman of color, right? Like you need to take it on personally. Then you need to build the structures, right? So that you have folks that are responsible for it, but also that you are really building it so that no one can just say, oh, I have to focus on this project or this budget or this deadline. It doesn't, that goes to that person over there and it's not part of my work. Everybody needs to know that it is part of the conversations that we have every day. It's about how we approach a candidate pool. It's about how we have conversations in the hiring process. It's about how we think about performance reviews. It's about how we think about all these different layers of how someone interacts with a company or an organization. And if that deep work beyond a statement and beyond just sort of a good intention, that deep work has to happen and it takes time. So we're way behind the 8 ball, but there's so much to be done and it really does belong to everybody. And I think the piece I like to, you know, I'm saying a lot about the C-suite, but I've also been super excited in these sort of crazy pandemic times, watching more and more employees recognize their power together to push on their C-suite, to push on their company overall, and to say this, I want to work in a place that is committed to this, and that is an opportunity to shift things in some really significant ways. So, you know, there's incredible stories about, you know, three quarters of the staff of base camp walking out of an employee meeting, you know, all staff hands-on meeting, recognizing that they weren't taking their, you know, personal commitments to racial equity seriously, and they were trying to just kind of say we're staying focused on business. Or I talked to you about that. You may have seen it, this like Washington Post op-ed by the CEO of the Washingtonian, I think, which is like an online paper, who basically put an op-ed in the Washington Post saying she would really have to, and you know, female CEO, we don't always get it right. Definitely, you can't ever assume that. You know, saying she would really have to question the loyalty of any employees that didn't want to come back to work in the office. You know, and the next day her entire team refused to publish it online. Wow. You know, just to say like, different people work in different ways. Different people find value and environment and a safe space in a different kind of way. And, you know, if you're not willing to meet your employees where they are, if you're not willing to create the space where they can thrive, like they're giving you their heart and soul, they're giving you hours and hours of their time and their life. And if you can't meet them where they are to build a culture that includes them and everyone around them that should be included, they may not deliver for you in the end, you know, like these are really important conversations to be having. So there's power and responsibility everywhere.
Thank you. That was such an incredible answer. There's so much really good information in what you've shared. Couple things, I mean, everyone's responsible, agreed. The quote, the middle management is where diversity goes to die. I wrote that down because I think I've experienced it in my own world working at Spencer Ogden, and I've experienced it, you know, I support a number of clients, and most of the folks that I work with are hiring managers. And exactly like you said, when you're talking to a hiring manager, they're trying to put out a fire, especially right now when the industry has grown faster than anyone has been able to deal with it.
Right, the quantity of hiring right now, some of these companies that are just exploding and the rate at which they're bringing people on, again, yeah, if you don't have the tools or the support around you and you're like, I just need a body in this job to like crunch a few numbers as fast as possible, you know, that's when like you had to have already done a lot of that relationship work so that you can move as fast as you need to. And so it's super intense. Totally.
Yeah, very intense. And, you know, on the one hand, you can't blame them because their top priority is I got to get the job done. So, you know, especially if we're talking about construction, right?
Oh my gosh.
Which is just a whole different ball game than maybe like a corporate white collar job. But yeah, you've just got to get the job done. But you're right. I mean, what I'm hearing you say is if the C-suite prioritizes DE&I initiatives in a meaningful way and not just in a, hey, overarching statement, we are committed to diversity. Anyway, how's that project going? You know, if it's more of a like, this is woven into our daily dialogue, this is something that's ingrained in our culture, then people will start to follow in that and I guess be that culture versus like try and create some culture just to like satisfy the stakeholders or whatever, or prospective candidates.
Or maybe that's a first though. I mean, if you're satisfying a stakeholder, right? What are the things that drive behavior? Right. And so, you know, I would love everybody to be driven, as I said, by like the goodwill and the value of like how important this work is, but that's not real for most. And so we have to recognize that if this is important and valuable, those of us that have access to the bigger picture and the structures have to say, okay, what will actually drive their behavior? And are they driven by their performance review and potential promotion and salary? Are they driven by their peers? Are they driven by a stakeholder, a particular stakeholder? What are the drivers and how do we line all of those up so they have no choice but to recognize the value of the diversity in their team or their space? Like, how do you look? There are so many small levers, and that's what we have to just make sure those are all in the right place. We can, you know, we can design the process so that it happens the way we want it to. But if we don't give it the resources to do that, the time and energy to do that, design that intention, that real intention, deep intention, it just won't happen.
Well, if people are motivated, or at least if companies and, you know, C-suite are motivated by talent, to your point earlier, that there are people while interviewing are looking around the room and they're looking at who they're interviewing with. And if you're interviewing with, you know, if it's a team of 5 or 6 and there's 5 or 6 white men on that interview panel, guess what? They're going to want to understand, what are you doing to increase diversity on your team? And they will choose another company based on the diversity of the team. I don't even want to tell you how many candidates in the last 6 months decline offers because they either didn't feel like the team was committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, or they were like, I feel like what you're telling me is just window dressing.
Totally
and
not genuine.
Yes.
I feel like you and I have maybe talked about this, but I say it a lot. Like, I feel like when you are part of a group that is considered a quote unquote minority, whether it really is or not, right? If you are part of this group that's not part of the dominant culture, over time, most of us develop some level of skill in what I say, you can smell a rat, right? Like it's that that sense of what's genuine, the sense of what's real, an intuition about like, how hard am I going to have to fight at this organization or in this company to do the work I want to do? How much am I going to have to put up with day to day just to come in and love my job? And that sort of intuition piece to me is like, if you really care about this as a company and you're not there yet, that's fine, but you need to be authentic and transparent. Otherwise, no one's going to come in, right? It's like, if you're not there, if you're sitting in a room with all white men and no one even addresses it, yeah, right? Like, how are, this is where the statements and rhetoric are part of the important first steps. But that's not enough to get you out of the water, right? They have to see that there's stuff happening underneath, that it's genuine, that you haven't just done the window dress. They haven't just said the words, but do you actually know what it means to take those words to heart, and that you recognize it's a journey. They're not coming in thinking like you have to have it all figured out and totally perfect, but they want to come in and know that there's commitment.
Yeah,
because they're saying like, I'm going to commit my life's energy to this work. How much are you committed to me and my life, right? Does my life matter to you? I'm here in this space, right? And that's, if they're like, actually all we care about is that you show up and do your job, that's actually not quite enough anymore.
Yeah, no, not anymore. Well, I'd love to kind of look into the future of renewables and RISE in particular. Is there anything on the horizon for RISE, any big plans, or where do you see RISE going in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are doing our best. I've been using the language of basically like jamming our foot in this door as much as humanly possible to try and make sure it stays open, and that we can bring our network to bear to open it even further. Like, I feel like everything that has happened over the last 18 months has really shifted so many conversations, right? Whether it's the pandemic side and like companies that never would have imagined a remote workforce, 2 years ago are like, okay, we are fully remote, or we are hybrid, whatever. They're evaluating entirely new dynamics, to the companies that have put out big statements about Black Lives Matter, or have put out other language and are actually, trying to figure out what it means. But I think we have only a limited time, right, of where people want to see action and progress and change. And we don't want that window to close as much as possible. Like, how do we keep that open? How do we keep that conversation moving? And how do we keep the momentum around all of that? And I'm excited that there, are a variety of ways that is happening across the sector. We've seen within our work and our network a lot of amazing women across the sector who are being charged with this work, for better or worse. As I said, a lot of companies like look around and pick that one person, and a lot of times they care about it, right? They're passionate about it, so they want to put their time and energy behind it. But that's, as I said many times earlier in the conversation, right, that's not enough. And so how do we, though, at the same time recognize those folks that are doing that work and figure out how to support them? So we've actually been doing a pilot cohort for diversity champions. And so it's been sort of private and pilot so far. And the plan is to roll that out publicly next year, probably by hopefully Q2, and to have that more available to everybody that's sort of in that space of sort of in the middle. Maybe it's a C-suite person that's engaged with it, but they're sort of navigating a company's new diversity initiative, or their affinity group, or their employee resource group, or something like that, and trying to lead diversity initiatives from within. We're also hoping to do some work to bring some of those CEOs and the C-suite together around some of this work. We have high hopes of building almost a think tank arm of RISE to basically lay out, there's some, we talked about, I'd love to see even more data on the demographics around the sector, but I also think there's a real lack of information about what different companies are doing from this policy and culture side, like who is doing what. And I hear that from companies a lot, like, what are our peers doing? Like, in this war for talent, are our benefits measuring up? Are we even close? Like, how does that all play out? And so we have a lot of interest in trying to start at least anonymously collecting that data and making it available, but hopefully over time, encouraging more and more companies to be as transparent as possible, sort of to lever, you know, the recognition that we're all sort of on this journey of figuring it out. And the more we can be transparent and hold each other accountable in it, the more likely we are to find those pieces that move us forward and can make it all better in the long run. So we're super excited about that stuff. We've also, as you said, have seen this huge explosion, both in hiring, but jobs overall, just exploding across companies all over the place. And you know, I've had a long history of getting frustrated with folks that tell me they're not getting enough women applying for engineering roles or things like that. Coming from an engineering background and continuing to go to conferences with the Society of Women Engineers, I see the packed rooms that show up for the sessions on sustainability. I see the lines that show up for like that one solar company in the exhibit hall booth area, right? So there's more and more interest growing. But I think there's also a lot of opportunity to do outreach to folks that have aligned skill sets, but may not recognize that this is the field for them or that the opportunity is here and what it looks like. So, you know, we're really interested in how do we build some big career fair infrastructure pieces that get more and more folks in, whether it's, you know, I know there's some other Department of Energy and others working on some broader sort of public marketing campaigns. And how do we help sort of build and leverage those so that the people that haven't found the sector yet do. And then for us, of course, that's paired with how are we really doing those deep dives with the companies so that when they do get that interview, when they do get that job, they're not like, oh, this is actually not where I want to work, right? We want it to be like they come in, they find it, they get that interview, and then they're like, oh my God, this is great. I can stay, I can be influential, I can grow here, I can be challenged. I'm going to have the resources I need and the support that I need. So how do we make sure sort of both sides of that are happening? It's a lot of the exciting stuff for us.
That's really exciting. A lot of really big things that you have planned that sounds like it'll be really valuable just for the whole industry. And I guess, look, I work with a lot of hiring managers. Like I said before, I think there's a lot of well-intentioned managers out there. And I think there are managers that are doing their part to actually embed in their culture. And, you know, they're not always people who would gravitate towards WRISE, right? It's like, you know, it's the white man who is going out there and like, you know, carrying the torch.
Actually committed. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. Which I really appreciate. Well, I think we all do. But I think that, I guess my question that I'm getting at is, you know, for those who maybe are have good intentions, are doing their best, but maybe it's not hitting, what would you recommend that they do, or how could WRISE help them maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always happy to have a conversation in general with someone who feels like they're trying and not getting there. You know, this sort of peer cohort of folks that are championing diversity, I think that's a great opportunity for folks to be involved in conversations and sort of share success stories across different levels and pieces of the work and what's happening and where things are going. And I think there's also a real opportunity for us to just continue to like really deep dive on the educational side of this, on all the opportunities that continue to be out there. There's so much information. So I think sometimes the challenge is like wading through it all. But how can you commit to that next step, to those next pieces? You know, minimally, the thing I send to everybody is what I think is a great site called biasinterrupters.org.
Okay.
So I highly encourage everyone to check it out. Like base level, if you're not getting things, that's a good place to start because they have very concrete toolkits for hiring and performance review. Like, how do you start to interrupt some of the classic things that we know about how bias shows up in an interview or how bias shows up in a meeting structure or things like that? How do you just really concretely create a few processes to shift that? So I feel like there's a lot of just like the base level stuff that more and more people doing those things and kind of building it again. So I talk about it from an organization and company culture, like how is it woven into every layer? But I think that's true for us as individuals too. And when we care about this and want to address it, how are we taking steps every day to shift our own thinking, to change our own mentality around what might be, you're not going to suddenly remove all of your bias, right? But how are we building things around us that force us to shift, right? That change the dynamics? How are we building relationships with, people that aren't just like us, or that, you need your community and your supporters and all of that, but you also need to be really intentional about how you shift your own perspectives and make sure you're getting access to the information and the ideas and all of the different things that are already out there. And we can do that in so many different ways, whether it's like reading books or watching movies or whatever, but how are you sort of pushing yourself outside of your sort of normal bubble?
Yeah. Well, that's really helpful. So basically, like, there's a lot of resources that maybe you could help folks to find, but just really.
Yeah, we can point you towards, we have like a clearinghouse of great diversity and equity consultants that we think are awesome. Like if you're ready to deep dive from a company perspective, we're happy to have, as an organization, WRISE, to have like an initial conversation about like different areas and things you might want to think about or focus on, all sorts of levels of how we can help. So yeah.
Well, I'll incorporate that into my discussions with my clients too, because
awesome.
As a third-party consultant, and as someone who's very active in WRISE, and I get a lot of interest from my clients, or a lot of questions about what they can do and how how the market looks, and they're always asking me for my expertise, and I give my own perspective just by being in, I'm talking to talent all day, every day, which is a good perspective, but I will definitely direct people to WRISE more. I mean, I always talk about WRISE and participating, and encouraging folks. Yeah, absolutely. And encouraging people to get their employees engaged and involved in the organization, I think, as a paid participant, because people are really, when you actually wear it as a badge versus oh, I went to a luncheon, right? It's no, I'm in WRISE, I participate. And WRISE has that brand recognition that everybody knows who you are. And if you've got folks in your organization that are participating, then that's at least one show of your commitment to DE&I. And even just to the professional development of your employees. That's what it's been for me.
No, that's a huge part of our work and what we do as well, is sort of that support for the individuals in their own career path and development, and access to the network, and all the different folks and tools and pieces around it. So it's a huge opportunity in terms of even just thinking about how you're providing value for your employees and getting them connected in. There's to that point of what company am I willing to fight to stay in, right? Or where am I willing to put my energy? Sometimes people leave because of a sense of isolation, right? Sometimes it's, a misconnection around, the challenges, how they want to advance their career, or sort of the myth of what career advancement looks like, and sort of a lack of clarity around how to be more challenged and have those opportunities. Sometimes it's around flexibility and sort of what the opportunities are to make their work fit into the life they want. But also there's this, sometimes, especially if you're one of the only ones, you're the only woman of color there, right? That sense of isolation can be detrimental to productivity, to overall work, to your desire to show up. And so if you can offer your employees the opportunity to at least be a part of a community, whether it's within your own company or more broadly by being a part of WRISE, having access to that sense of community and recognition that you're not alone can be a driver for staying engaged in your work and involved.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you. This has been extremely illuminating. I think that everyone will find a lot of value in a lot of the advice that you've given, and we'll definitely send folks on to WRISE's website for some more resources when they're seeking some additional support. But thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Yes. Thank you so much for having this conversation. I think it's such an important one, and so I'm glad to be a part of it.
Yeah, thank you.